program brings together under one banner scholarships offered by the Department of Education, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research. And whereas Dr. Tara Wright of the Environmental Science Program has been awarded one of two prestigious Australian Endeavour Executive Fellowships. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the House Assembly congratulate Tara Wright and wish her continued success in the future. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? It is agreed. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. Barring no other notices of motion, we'll move on to orders of the day and oral questions put by members to ministers. The time is now 2:31. We will conclude question period at 4:01. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on March 21st, the Premier visited Amherst to speak to the Chamber of Commerce there. Many people from Cumberland County attended looking for answers as to why there's been such a long delay in completing a forensic audit of the Cumberland Regional Development Authority, or CREDA. The Premier told them there will be more information soon, and I'm glad to know he is on top of the issue, Mr. Speaker. This is a $200,000 audit reviewing nearly $20 million of taxpayers' money, and it is almost a year late. A delay that has been attributed to a local law firm, Hicks Lemoyne, which was withholding key audit evidence. I'd like to ask the Premier now to confirm that that audit evidence has been turned over to the auditors and update the House on when we can expect the audit to be completed.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll ask the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism to respond.
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you, Speaker, and I appreciate the question from the Leader of the Opposition. This audit started in January 2013, and obviously we are quite concerned as to the length of time that this audit has taken. I do believe that the Leader of the Opposition may be incorrect with some of the assumptions that he does make, but I can advise him that the issue relating to any evidence that was being held by the law firm in question has been turned over to the auditors, but there are other issues that they are reviewing as well.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I certainly invite the Minister to provide more information so that people in Cumberland County, including their representative, have all the facts to judge exactly what is going on. Mr. Speaker, holding back audit evidence is wrong. It is particularly wrong when taxpayers' money is involved. The delay in this case has been attributed publicly to Hicks Lemoyne, the law firm for CREDA. It's good news to hear today that we have confirmation that the audit records that they have been turned over. Unfortunately, when the Minister was asked why it took so long in allnovascotia.com in February, he refused to say whether his department had anything to do with turning over the records from the law firm to the auditors of CREDA. Taxpayers deserve to know, Mr. Speaker, if they have been asked to pay what is essentially ransom money to get access to their own audit records. So I'd like to ask the Premier or the Minister if they could tell the House whether the Government of Nova Scotia paid any amount of money to Hicks Lemoyne to recover the audit records.
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Mr. Speaker, I do believe that the Leader of the Opposition does hold a certain professional certification, and I would suspect that he would appreciate that during an audit it would be inappropriate to start having discussions regarding an audit until its final conclusions in order not to in any way jeopardize or taint the audit. We look forward to seeing these results as soon as possible. I would remind the Leader of the Opposition again, this audit began in January 2013 under a previous administration in this province.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, it's because the audit is almost a year overdue that I am asking the Minister these questions today. You know, Mr. Speaker, in a way it's very sad the new government came in. This truly was a problem of the previous government, but 6 months has gone by and still we are no further ahead at seeing a forensic audit or the results so that people in Cumberland County and indeed all Nova Scotia taxpayers can judge for themselves what went on. What taints audits, Mr. Speaker, is when people that hold important audit files withhold them. What taints audits is when a government comes in and sits back for 6 months and leaves those records hidden from the people of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. What taints audits is when a government is asked a simple question like, did they pay that firm our money to do what they should have done in the first place, which is to hand over those records? It doesn't take a chartered accountant to know that that answer is offensive to the people of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. So I'll ask the Premier or his designate the question that all Cumberland County residents want to know, and that is, when will this audit be done? And the only way to make sure that people can have any confidence in it is if he stands in his place right now and assures the people of Cumberland County those results, no matter what they say, will be made public for everyone to see.
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Mr. Speaker, again, this audit started in January 2013. It's being conducted by an external party that is not under the control of our government. We are looking forward to seeing the results of this audit as soon as possible. The information that the leader is asking for, I have no doubt, will all be made available once the audit is finally completed. I am certainly hopeful that the external company which is undertaking this audit on behalf of the province of Nova Scotia will be able to complete its work in the very near future.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you today is to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, as the Premier said in 2007, essential service legislation does not work because it leads to increased tension in negotiations and leads to wildcat strikes. Morale is already low at Capital Health, Mr. Speaker, and I think we would all like to see it improve. So I'd like to ask the Premier, does the Premier think disciplinary action will do anything to improve the working conditions for the nurses at Capital Health?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. It was brought to the floor of the House yesterday, Mr. Speaker. The employer, Mr. Speaker, Capital Health, has been calling in a number of nurses who have taken illegal job action, Mr. Speaker. So it is the right of the employer to question whether or not why that illegal job action had taken place, and we wait to hear the outcome of the conversation.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Cobequid on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Premier told CTV News that, I quote, "What I can tell you quite frankly is if people were working for me as the Premier of this province, working for the government, and they took illegal job action, I'd be calling them into my office as well," end quote. And I'll table that article, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask the Premier, does the Premier believe his comments yesterday were helpful in improving nurses' morale at Capital Health?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I think all members of this House know there are laws in this province, Mr. Speaker, and they want all Nova Scotians to respect them. Simple as that.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Cobequid on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Upon hearing of the Premier's comments about calling them into his office, many healthcare workers wrote us, Mr. Speaker. One healthcare social worker suggested the Premier was kicking a hornet's nest. Another nurse said that while the Premier wouldn't meet with them during law amendments or during the debate on essential service legislation, they would be willing to meet with the Premier now. So I'd like to ask the Premier, through you, Mr. Speaker, since these nurses are willing to take the Premier up on his offer to be called into his office, will the Premier agree to meet with them after Cabinet next week?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the honourable member knows, and considering he's the former Minister of Health, that the nurses actually work for Capital Health. They're the employer, Mr. Speaker. Capital Health has actually called the employees to meet with them. I would encourage them to meet with their employer, and so that we continue to move down the road, ensuring that essential service is in place. And if the union then wants to take job action and go on strike, Mr. Speaker, they can do so.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask this question to the Minister of Economic Development. A few moments ago, I asked him quite simply whether the government of Nova Scotia had paid money, any taxpayers' money, to Hicks Lemoyne to turn over audit records, something they should have done of their own free will, as anyone else would be compelled to do so. There is no reason not to tell us today whether they did or not, so I'd like to ask the Minister directly, did taxpayers pay Hicks Lemoyne to turn over those audit records, yes or no?
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Mr. Speaker, there is a third party that is conducting an audit on behalf of the province of Nova Scotia. That audit started in January 2013 by the previous government. We are certainly looking forward to seeing the results of that audit, but I have no intentions of debating what may or may not be in that audit until such time as that audit is provided to the province.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, it's pretty obvious to anyone here today. I'm not asking him to tell us what's in the audit. We're all waiting to see. We've all been waiting to see for more than a year. But my question is purely and simply, did the government of Nova Scotia pay money to Hicks Lemoyne so that they would turn over audit evidence? What the auditor does with it is completely a different question, Mr. Speaker. There is no reason why the minister should hide from the taxpayers of Nova Scotia whether more of their money was thrown at that law firm or not today. There's none. So I'll ask the minister directly, why won't you tell us? More importantly, why won't you tell taxpayers whether you used that money to pay ransom, essentially, to Hicks Lemoyne or not?
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I would encourage the Leader of the Opposition to go outside this chamber and to make the comments that he is making, because I believe very clearly he's chosen to use the House as a means to impugn motive against a law firm in this province, and if he wishes to do so, I would hope he would not hide behind parliamentary privilege in making such a statement. But look, Mr. Speaker, no government stands here and debates the contents of audits until audits are completed. We are not about to change that process.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the only person hiding today is a minister of the Crown that will not tell taxpayers of Nova Scotia whether he used their money to pay a law firm to do what they ought to have done anyway for free, Mr. Speaker. Not actually questioning the motives of the firm. I'm questioning whether the government itself used our money to get something that should be available to the auditor at no charge, Mr. Speaker. It seems pretty simple to me. The minister's not going to answer the question. The audit's been going on for a year and a half. All Nova Scotians want to know what really happened to their money in the case of Creta. Mr. Speaker, there's no good reason why that audit should take a year and a half. You know, the Royal Bank is audited in less than 50 days every year. It's 1,000 times the size of Creta, and yet here we are still waiting. So I will ask the minister, so she won't tell us simply whether they paid for the evidence or not. How long is this going to go on before Nova Scotians get the answers they deserve?
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't know how good the Leader of the Opposition's front stroke is, but I certainly know now how good his backstroke is in seeing how quick he is to try to distance himself when called to account for his own comments here in the legislature. Mr. Speaker, I share in the frustration at how long this has taken. This was an audit that's being undertaken by a third party, independent of government. We would certainly have hoped this audit would have been completed. It started in January 2013 under a previous government. We are looking forward to results of that audit, which I do hope will be completed as soon as possible. But I would think that the Leader of the Opposition as well would not be encouraging us to have an audit completed before the auditors clearly feel that their work has been carried out.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Minister of Justice indicated that cases such as those of Jerry Barton are sometimes more complex than what we hear in the media. She also said that there has not been a verdict of the nature I spoke about, but I was speaking about the 2011 Court of Appeal decision that Mr. Barton was wrongfully convicted. Does the Minister agree that Barton was wrongfully convicted as found by the Court of Appeal?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I will simply say this, that as the Attorney General, it is not appropriate for me to make any comments on this topic while it's still proceeding before the courts. Thank you.
The honourable member for Inverness on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the minister acknowledges that Mr. Barton was treated unfairly. Why hasn't she convened an independent judicial inquiry to consider compensation for Mr. Barton?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It appears that the member opposite is having difficulty understanding the response. I have no further comments to make on this topic until a verdict has been reached by the justice system, by the judiciary. Thank you.
The honourable member for Inverness on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know that Mr. Barton could go ahead with trying to prove that the judicial system, that there was a malicious prosecution at the time, but it's difficult to go back to 1971 and to find all the documents and what would be required to prove that. And I don't believe a court case should have any bearing on a man who was deemed wrongfully convicted. We do know that from the Marshall inquiry, it was recommended that when a person is wrongfully convicted, an independent judicial inquiry should be held to consider compensation. And that's all that I'm asking about today, Mr. Speaker. So I don't expect an answer, Mr. Speaker, but I will ask one more time, aren't we supposed to learn something from the past? And if the justice system does not feel some pain here by way of compensation to Barton, will the attitude that they displayed in the past come up again to haunt us in the future?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Documents that were presented in a court proceedings are public, and I would invite, or they will be public, and I would invite the honourable member opposite to go and view those whenever he wishes. At the moment, the case has been heard. We are awaiting written submissions. After that, the judge will make his findings. When that happens, when it's appropriate to do so, we will present, if we have any statements to make at that point in time, we will. At the moment, we have no further comment to make on it because it has not been decided in the courts. Thank you.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne. For Chester St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Education. Parents and community leaders in HRM affected by the school boundary review involving Grosvenor Wentworth Park and Park West are concerned. They are being told their school board representatives will not meet with members of the community to hear their concerns while this review is proceeding. My question through you to the Minister is, why does the Minister feel it is acceptable for elected school board officials to refuse to hear concerns from community leaders?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the member opposite. The members should know, and others in the House should know, that a boundary review is the responsibility of a school board. School boards do boundary reviews all of the time, and there are steps along the way where parents and community members can be heard. And while that process is underway and it is the responsibility of the board, this minister will not interfere.
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's on her first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the elected school board representative for Park West School is telling concerned community members that she is not allowed to meet with people to hear their concerns because she could lose her right to speak to the matter as well as lose her right to vote. So my question through you to the Minister is, what is the point of having elected boards if their members will not listen to the valid concerns of their constituents?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would say to the parents and community members in Park West or in the area that's affected by the boundary review that if they have concerns about their elected board member, they go directly to their board chair.
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Janet Lee is a community representative on the Park West School Advisory Council, and she is here today to highlight this issue in her community. She has requested a meeting with the Minister. So through you, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister, will the Minister meet with Ms. Lee, and will elected school board representatives be advised that they have the right and a duty to meet with concerned community members about this particular issue.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And we have received correspondence from many families and many parents in the Park West area. We have responded to those, and we have encouraged them to allow the school board to continue the process and for those parents to participate along the process so that their voices can be heard.
The Honourable Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you today is to the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia is an aging population, something we're very well aware of, and healthcare costs, unfortunately, are expected to continue to increase. Monitoring healthcare, diseases, vaccines, and outbreaks, etc., will help make our system safer and more efficient. Having a system that simply collects data and reports on this data doesn't seem to be that complicated compared to some of the other systems, like the private sector banks, credit agencies, and so on, Mr. Speaker. My question to the Minister, why is the input system so complex compared to the systems we see in the private sector?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and to the member for Hants West. The province a number of years ago started a program, a national program called Panorama that we were all hoping was going to be one of the very strong solutions to greater surveillance in our province. But we discovered that it was very costly, going very slow, and as we analyzed some first data, not able to, in fact, achieve some of the results that we were hoping to achieve.
The Honourable Member for Hants West on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Minister for his answer, and we learned today in public accounts just that. Some of that discussion took place. The Deputy Minister explained that the cost estimate for an electronic surveillance system could come into the 2015-16 budget year. How long, my question is, how much study needs to happen before we have an estimate of the cost getting this system to create these efficiencies and to better protect Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Very much, Mr. Speaker, and to the member opposite, he raises a good question because the greater surveillance, the greater data collection that we do have, then we can work with that to achieve stronger results, especially when it comes to anything of an epidemic nature. We're able to take a look at the history of individuals. And he asked about where we are, and at the current moment, there is a great deal of that information that is hard copied. It's not in electronic records. We've been able to do very well with the records we do have, as we saw from the vaccination problem with a pediatric specialist this fall, and we're able to, in fact, notify all of the parents and all those concerned. This is a program where the platform is now being laid out to make sure that we start down the road of an electronic medical record that will have all of that surveillance information.
The Honourable Member for Hants West on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the Minister. And he mentioned a moment ago about the paper copy being kept, and we know that that's creating some issues within the system, or lengthy research time, risk of loss, cost, and the inability to respond to risk as effectively and as thorough as an electronic system could. And today in public accounts, something of great concern that was mentioned, the Deputy Chief Medical Health Officer said that the current system is not fit to function in the current environment. So my question to the Minister, can Nova Scotians feel safe when the Deputy Chief Medical Health Officer says our system does not work in the current environment?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and after the public accounts today, I did have a session with department officials because I do want that kind of assurance that I can tell Nova Scotians that, in fact, we have a good system, but it's a good system that needs to be modernized and updated and we have not found our records wanting when they have been called upon to provide good information, appropriate information, and in as reasonable a time as some of the manual record keeping is able to provide.
The honourable member for Sydney Whitney Pier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Justice. On March 30th, 2011, the previous government announced a system for reporting of major incidents at the Nova Scotia correctional facilities. According to the policy, any assault committed by a person in custody against another person within a correctional facility while in custody of sheriff services or while in court resulting in serious injury that requires inpatient hospitalization must be reported. But according to a February 14th article in the Halifax Herald, which I will table, a February assault on a female prison guard where the victim suffered a broken jaw and was knocked unconscious was not disclosed to the public. This was not the only serious incident that has gone unreported under the government. My question for the Minister, why are not all serious incidents at the correctional facilities being reported by her department?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We have excellent staff at our correctional facility who do very good work in very difficult environment. Anytime a staff member is hurt, that is a concern to us. We've been working very hard with our staff, with our union. We have a zero tolerance policy, and these incidents are reported. Thank you.
The honourable member for Sydney Whitney Pier on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, according to the same disclosure policy released on March 11th at 2:11, it is the Minister of Justice who decides whether or not incident reports will be posted on the department's website or disclosed to the media. My question to the Minister of Justice, can she tell this House of any serious incidents, including drug seizures, assault, power outages, or wrongful releases at the correctional facilities that have occurred in 2014 that she has not chosen to disclose publicly, and if so, why not?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm not aware of any such incidents that have not been reported, that were supposed to be recorded as per the acts and regulations. Thank you.
The honourable member for Sydney Whitney Pier on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, every day the guards at our correctional facilities put themselves at risk to protect both the public and the safety of inmates. They have a tough job, and the public has the right to know that the government is taking the necessary steps to keep our correctional facility workers safe. My question for the Minister of Justice, what steps has she taken since becoming Minister to improve the safety of workers and inmates at Nova Scotia's 5 provincial correctional facilities?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much to the member opposite. Look, these are correctional facilities. These facilities house many dangerous offenders that have broken the law. We have many checks and balances in place. There will always be challenges that we not only face in Nova Scotia, but that are indeed faced across Canada and North America. We continue to work with our staff. We're looking very closely at all the details to review to ensure that we're doing everything we can to prevent these things from happening. Thank you.
The honourable member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question for the Minister of Health. When trying to analyze a disease, understanding how it is being spread, where it's being spread, and to whom it's being spread are key determinants, obviously, in how we fight said disease. If there were a situation where the health system needed to find a level of population coverage for a specific disease, could the health system do that in a timely fashion?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And what I can assure the member from Hants West is that we have a system that is as good and as strong as any in the country. Only Quebec and Ontario even have started down the road of electronic system of surveillance around disease. And so I know that if we take a look at H1N1 and the response of our province, and when we went to, and when that was handed over to Department of Health and Wellness specialists in the crisis center, and how quickly we mobilized our officials to get the vaccination out, I think that incident alone speaks very strongly about the kind of work that is being done at health and wellness around disease control.
The honourable member for Hants West on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it will be my final supplementary as well. Just quickly to the Minister, if a specific area or demographic is specifically susceptible to a disease or is a high rate of a disease, can our current system isolate these communities to develop campaigns of awareness to help reduce that risk?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the member from Hants West. I know that it would not be as quick if we had an electronic system in place. I'm pleased to say that, in fact, we are active on the file of getting an e-record that would be very quickly able to isolate a cohort in the population that could be most impacted by a particular communicable disease. And so while we're not there yet, the records that we have, the people in place at the Department of Health and Wellness, I think as was identified by Dr. Frank Atherton today, who is the deputy in the department in that area of medical health, public health official, I think we can be well assured here in our province that we would be as timely as any other part of Canada in responding.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal. Mr. Speaker, does the Minister and his Liberal government support toll highways?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much, and I thank the member opposite for the question. With respect to toll highways, there are no plans. We haven't had any discussions with respect to where we would go or wouldn't go with toll highways. Obviously, the one toll highway in our province within the Cobequid Pass has been one I think that's shown success with respect to how the road is maintained and operated. That model has proven pretty effective, I think, for successive governments in this province. We certainly have an infrastructure deficit in this province. There's no question about it. We haven't gone down the road of toll highway conversations. We're going to stick to our capital plan. We're going to use the federal government as partners to try to leverage dollars for those major builds. Right now, Mr. Speaker, we're just trying to do the best we can within the envelope for our capital plan and our operational budgets. So we haven't made any decisions whatsoever, and we'll continue to take it one day at a time, and we'll do our best to keep the road safe. Thank you.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we look back at the 1990s. The minister was a young lad playing street hockey when the decision was made to build a P3 road. And in opposition, he and the Minister of Natural Resources used to say, that was 25 years ago. No one cares. Well, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians care. Let me remind everyone that the Western Alignment Highway 104 Act, it says that the Freedom of Information does not apply. The company does not have to apply for building permits. It doesn't have to pay taxes, and it's exempt from oversights of the Public Utilities Act. Not to mention, the lead lawyer on the file who negotiated the contract was none other than now the Liberal Senator Jim Cohen. Coincidence? I'm not sure, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotians knows what happened in the 1990s, and we're already seeing that history does repeat itself. Mr. Speaker, my question to the minister is, has he had any discussions or correspondence on whether or not the Liberals will move ahead with toll highways in other parts of our province?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And just for clarity, I'll tell the member that when I played street hockey, that was in the 80s when there was a Conservative government and there was too many potholes. We really couldn't play street hockey. So, just kidding. Just a joke. Just a joke. Trying to keep it lighthearted, Mr. Speaker, but there wasn't too many smiles across the way, so I'll stick to the question. The reality is that The member did talk about previous governments and what I've said in the past about previous governments and what my colleague from the Minister of Natural Resources says still holds true today. I'm not guided by any decisions of any past government, of any stripe. That's not how we do business. We're taking things in 2014 for the people of Nova Scotia. We're going to make the best decisions that we can. Again, there's been no commitments. We haven't had a whole lot of information with respect to toll highways other than the one that's currently in place, and that's where we're at today. And again, we're not guided by any of the past. We're looking at the present and making things better for the future. Thank you.
The honourable member for Queen Shelburne.
Mr. Speaker, I'll take the bait, because if we go with this minister's policy on paving and turning pavement back into gravel, we're going to have a lot more potholes. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians are reminded every time they pass through the tolls of Cobequid Pass that it was the Liberal governments of the 1990s that placed the tolls on I repeat, every single vehicle that enters and exits our province. As the minister has said many times in the House, the reason the Liberals cut money to building highways is due to the federal government's decrease in transfers to our province. For those Nova Scotians who are watching at home, it's exactly what this Liberal government has said in the 1990s, and that's why they had to move to P3 roads. Mr. Speaker, if the federal government is reducing transfers, and we know that the Western Alliance Corporation is ahead of schedule in paying back its obligations, what year will they pay back their obligations? And does that mean that the Liberals will take the tolls off the Highway 104 or continuing taxing Nova Scotians? Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, just for clarity's sake, I did not say at any point that the federal government reduced the amount of money coming into the province. The Build Canada funds, the Gateway funds, these large-scale infrastructure programs, we set an agreement in a certain time for a certain amount of money. That money is guaranteed from the federal government. So what we do when we complete projects, we estimate when those projects will be completed, and then we forecast the money received based on that. So I've never said that the federal government reduced money, and I've said that those projects and those infrastructure programs are invaluable for the people of Nova Scotia, and we'll continue to work with our federal partners on those. Again, Mr. Speaker, the member does criticize the Cobequid Pass. I think that, from the important link it is for transportation for our province and interprovincial travel for our economy, of course, through that area and for all Nova Scotians, I think that the mechanism that was set up for the tolls has proven to be beneficial. There's certainly problems with the weather and that area with respect to snow and ice and those types of things, no question about it, but I don't think that Nova Scotians feel saddled by that decision. I think that it's one that's helped us improve traffic between our province and the other provinces. And, Mr. Speaker, again, we have no commitment with respect to toll highways at this point. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Honourable Minister of Agriculture. Last weekend I attended the annual general meeting of the North Nova Cattle Growers Association, at which we enjoyed a lovely dinner of beef grown right in Cumberland North. But at that meeting I talked to some farmers there who own small mixed farming operations that sell organic meat and produce to local markets. These are family operations, Mr. Speaker, where the owners and their families perform all of the functions required to produce their goods and get them to market. I asked them if they were satisfied with the programs being offered by the Department of Agriculture to assist farmers in the province. Their response was that they had not bothered to apply for any government programs for several years due to the complexity of the program requirements and the amount of paperwork and red tape involved. My question for the minister is, what is the Department of Agriculture doing with regards to simplifying program delivery for the benefit of this important industry?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the honourable member for the question. Indeed, we have changed programs to make it easier for people to apply. We've directed our staff to help the individuals that do apply and the farms that do make applications, to help them with those applications if there's any difficulty. And from what I hear from my staff, it's the first time in many, many years that they have so many people coming into the offices, calls to visit the farms, and go out and actually participate and help them do those documentation. So I think we've made a very important step forward. It's a change that I made immediately after becoming minister, and it puts more accountability and easier access to these important programs for farms of all size.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism, who has insisted that his government will be making changes to the Cabinet-controlled Jobs Fund. However, the Minister nor the Premier will answer whether or not they will actually remove it 100% from Cabinet's control. Mr. Speaker, my question only needs a simple answer, yes or no. Will the Minister remove the Jobs Fund from Cabinet's control?
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to advise my honourable colleague that, as we indicated, as the Premier did before the session, legislation will be coming forward during this session that will address the very question that she's raising today.
The honourable member for Pictou West on her first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Which leads actually into my next question. The Minister has said that he will introduce legislation to change the Jobs Fund during this session, and I'll table that document. However, on the first day of the spring sitting, the government released their legislative agenda. Changes to the Job Fund were not included, and I will table that as well. Not only was the legislative agenda released last week after the Trav's report, but the Premier has been in favour of removing the Jobs Fund from Cabinet for years. The government cannot pretend they were unprepared for this. Why wasn't legislation about the Job Fund included on the government's legislative agenda, despite knowing for years what changes should be made?
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
I'm not sure how much clearer I can be, Mr. Speaker. Whatever we said in the list of bills, we did not include every single piece of legislation that would come before us, but I do believe, again, the dangers of reading questions in this House, in that, as I indicated in my first answer, legislation to address the issue with the Jobs Fund and economic development direction for this province will be coming during this sitting of the House.
The honourable member for Pictou West on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2010, in light of the Auditor General releasing a report calling for Cabinet-controlled funding programs to end, the Premier said the Auditor General was backing up what he had been saying for years, and that went along with my other documents I tabled. For years later, we have had 2 Auditor General reports and a government commissioned report by Dr. Travs calling for Cabinet to release control of this fund, and the Liberal government hasn't budged. When can Nova Scotians expect this government to follow the advice of these 2 leading experts, and we'd like to know what month?
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Mr. Speaker, as I indicated, our government, when we were elected, heard loud and clear from Nova Scotians with concerns that they had regarding the previous administration's use of taxpayers' money for economic development purposes. We undertook a number of reviews. Those reviews are in. Legislation will be coming very shortly, and Mr. Speaker, I certainly look forward to receiving the support of the honourable member from Pictou West in support of our legislation to ensure that economic development in the future will be done in a responsible way and one that Nova Scotians can be proud of.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question today is for the Minister of the Environment. In August of last year, the Department of Environment announced an expansion of the Environmental Home Assessment Program. Homeowners would receive more help replacing oil tanks and addressing septic system issues with this expansion, and I will table that release, Mr. Speaker. Families who need to replace their oil tanks should receive up to $1,000 to purchase a tank based on income, and homeowners with septic problems should receive up to $3,000 to repair or replace their systems. So my question today for the Minister is, the funding totaling $1.5 million was to be available this spring. So will the Minister tell the members of this House when Nova Scotians can apply for help from this expanded program?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member opposite for the question. I guess the first thing to note is, yes, that was an announcement that was made in August. It's one that I was aware of before the election was actually called, but it was one where the funding was not explicitly made available as a part of that announcement. It was a deferred expense proposed by the previous government, and it's one with respect to how we're proceeding with our programs and services as part of the budget process that this House and the Estimates Committee is going through, and certainly that's part of what's being evaluated as part of that process and budgeting.
The honourable member for Truro, Baba Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River on her first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that answer does not make me feel very confident with this government going forward, because as we know, most Nova Scotians have oil tanks and that's how they heat their houses. In fact, we have about 200,000 domestic oil tanks, and tanks that are in poor condition are the leading cause of oil spills. Oil spills can cost tens of thousands of dollars to clean up, something which low-income families just simply can't afford. So, therefore, my question to the minister is, what's the minister's message to Nova Scotians who want to prevent oil spills but needed this support from the province in order to do so?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I guess the key message is that this government has a wide variety of programs and services that are available to people of low income, and of which certainly senior citizens end up being a large portion of that population, unfortunately. And we do have a wide number of programs and services offered to help with various household improvements that are available within the province, and certainly my messaging is to look at all programs and services offered by the government, and certainly the 211 number is available, or local MLA constituency offices, to help all of the citizens of this province to get the answers they need for the services and programs appropriate to them.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Salmon River on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, as Minister of the Environment, one would hope that he would be very concerned about the environment, as well as in helping Nova Scotians continue to be able to afford proper heating for their homes in a safe manner that's not going to affect the environment. So helping Nova Scotians replace aging oil tanks doesn't just make good environmental sense, it makes good economic sense too. Vilco in Waverley and AFL Tank Manufacturing in Arashat, for instance, both manufacture oil tanks and would have benefited from this program. So my question for the minister is, why won't he commit to putting Nova Scotia's environment and economy first by following through on the expansion of the Environmental Home Assessment Program, which is going to be a very, very positive program for the environment and for the people of Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Mr. Speaker, thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to respond to that. And I guess the most direct response I can provide to that is I would encourage the honourable member across the way to read the legislation that actually guides the purpose and the mandate of the Nova Scotia Department of Environment, and we are a regulatory body, and that is the primary responsibility of this body, of this department, and it is the direction that I take very seriously. So I'm guided by the legislation and the regulations governing this department, and that's how I make my decisions. Thank you.
The honourable member for Sackville, Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today is through you to the Minister of Health. I know I was pleased prior to the past election, Mr. Speaker, my role to see the Department of Health and Wellness making progress on the plan for the development of the 5th floor at the Dartmouth General. I know many residents over in Dartmouth and many members of the Liberal government currently were pleased to see that progress moving forward. So I'd like to ask the Minister of Health if the Minister could indicate that this important work is ongoing.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and to the member for Sackville, Cobequid. I don't know how work done for 4 years is actually being measured, because all the briefings that I have indicate very little work. our government is picking up the call from the Dartmouth General and from the QE2 Foundation to start to look at this project, and of course the need for work to be done there. But it is still a long way in terms of planning for the 5th floor.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I think the member from Dartmouth East won't like those comments. Maybe the minister missed a briefing note, so maybe I'll educate him a little bit. The Dartmouth General Plan was to add 2 operating rooms and 51 inpatient beds, Mr. Speaker. And I know Capital Health has been working to come up with the plan of design for that, Mr. Speaker. So can the minister confirm, for the benefit of the people of Dartmouth and maybe the benefit of the member from Dartmouth East, that the department still plans to add 2 operating rooms and 51 beds to the Dartmouth General?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and to the member opposite. We know that across the province there are a number of facilities that need upgrades and updating, and the need for work at the Dartmouth General is very apparent, and it is part of a larger plan for the redevelopment of the Centennial Building, and I think the work being done to prepare and plan is now picking up momentum, and hopefully residents of Metro will not have to wait too much longer before there is some firm news.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I know the member from Dartmouth East is helping me as I prepare for my final supplementary here, Mr. Speaker. I know, and the member from Dartmouth East knows, that the overall plan initially did not call for the redevelopment of the 5th floor at the Dartmouth General. It was the previous government that indicated that needed to happen, and the Capital Health was directed to go back and redesign the utilization of the 5th floor with operating rooms and inpatient beds, Mr. Speaker. So the minister just offered in his answer that soon we'll hear from him on what that plan is. Will the minister give this House and residents of Dartmouth and the member from Dartmouth East a timeline on when the 2 operating rooms and 51 inpatient beds will open on the 5th floor at the Dartmouth General?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and to the member opposite. You know, there is actually a more pressing concern at Dartmouth General, as has been identified, and that is, of course, with infection control. Is requiring work on the 2nd and 3rd floor, and that is a priority of our government. And as we move into the larger plan for Capital Health, I believe you will hear very shortly that the 5th floor is part of the bigger Capital Health plan.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today is for the Minister responsible for Information Management. I thought you might like that.
Is that for him or for him?
I see him checking his notes over there. Yesterday, the people of Nova Scotia learned that an outside consulting firm will conduct an investigation into the provincial landline telephone contract. Now, this is a contract that could be valued at more than $64 million. It appears that whichever company lost out in the bid feels that the evaluation team in charge of the bid was biased. Now, despite the controversy, the minister has not yet informed taxpayers who made up the province's evaluation team. And this is something that I think Nova Scotians deserve to know. So my question today for the minister is, will the minister be forthright with Nova Scotians and tell us today who in the Liberal government was responsible for making this controversial contract decision to begin with?
The Honourable Minister of the Public Service Commission and Internal Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure if I follow the question. The member from the other side is saying that someone in the Liberal government made up the contract or awarded the contract. That is not the case. So if we get some clarification as to what role he thinks the Liberals played in this contract, then perhaps I could answer his question.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Mr. Speaker, I'm so disappointed. We waited 6 months to ask a question and you still can't understand what we're asking. Perhaps the minister missed some news out of his department that he's responsible for, but there's quite a significant contract that has to do with provincial landline telephone business, and it could be a contract worth up to $64 million. So there's some controversy over how that tendering process was followed when the bid team. And sadly, this isn't the first time that serious questions have been raised about the tendering process for government contracts under the Liberal administration. The government already has a bad record on making patronage appointments. So Nova Scotians deserve to know how decisions are being made with their money. So I don't know why the minister is so reluctant to provide details on how government contracts are being awarded. So I'll ask him for a second time if he'd be honest and tell Nova Scotians.
Order, please. Order, please. I'd like to remind the member for Pictou East that it's unparliamentary to refer to any member of this House as being dishonest. The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I apologize to the Minister and to the House. So my question today is why is the Minister so reluctant to provide details about how government contracts are being awarded?
The Honourable Minister of the Public Service Commission and Internal Services.
Mr. Speaker, the way government contracts are awarded in this province are fair and they are without political interference. The Liberal government had nothing to do with this contract, and for anyone in this House or anywhere to imply that we did is wrong. Mr. Speaker, I will give you a little bit of background with this contract. The contract was awarded within our procurement process. There was employees within the Public Service Commission, within the Information Management Department that looked over the contract and scored the contract, and at that point made an award. The contract had not been given to a vendor, and at that point there was suggestion made that perhaps we did not follow our own process within procurement. So at that point, when this was brought to my attention, I halted the process. I turned it over to internal audit, independent of government, independent of our party and any party in this House. An internal audit has taken the process at that point. They have hired a consulting firm, which is Grant Thornton. Grant Thornton is reviewing the process, and we look forward to that report coming back, which, again, I will repeat, is completely independent of the Liberal Party. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm glad I was able to refresh the Minister's memory on this very significant situation, because now we seem to know a lot about it. But obviously, you know, every Nova Scotian deserves to feel that they have a fair chance when they're trying to earn government business, and certainly every company deserves to have that they have a fair chance to earn government business. And in this case, we do have a situation where a company feels that they didn't, and that the process was biased. And sadly, the Liberal Party has a long history of rewarding its friends when in government. From the old cash for liquor sales kickback scheme right up to the appointment of the province's new protocol officer, it pays to be a Liberal supporter. So I certainly hope that...
Does the member have a question?
Will the minister responsible for this decision guarantee taxpayers today that political considerations are in no way a factor when determining who benefits from government business?
The Honourable Member of Minister of the Public Service Commission and Internal Services.
Mr. Speaker, it is my great pleasure to tell this House that there will be no political interference with this contract or any other contract given in the province of Nova Scotia. I will go further to say that it is irresponsible for a member who holds a designation to actually question the internal auditors who also hold similar designation in this province and question what they are and question their ability to be fair and impartial. I would also go on further that it's not fair to actually question Grant Thornton in them being impartial. So I would ask the member to not attack people within the public service and also consulting firms in the province that hold designations and they have ethical duties that they abide by. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Community Services. Yesterday, the minister accused Roots for Youth of criticizing Shift in Yarmouth for receiving funding, and I'll table that document. The minister was incorrect in her accusation, and this was entirely unfair. The point made by my colleague from Pictou Centre was that both organizations are worthy of government funding, and that all youth deserve equal attention, especially those that are homeless, and that the minister should consider regional needs when making decisions. So my question is, will the minister apologize for inaccurately characterizing Roots for Youth's request?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe I accused political actors in this House of pitting nonprofits against each other. And as someone who is from the nonprofit community, I'm well aware of the political games that go on with the respect of funding for nonprofits in different regions of the province. I've made the commitment to the honourable member that I will come up and spend the day, and we will see that organization as well as a few others in her area. I stand by that commitment, and I hope that she can arrange that day with my staff, and I look forward to that next month.
The honourable member for Pictou West on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The minister insisted that the decision to fund Shift was to keep a platform promise. She said not less than 5 minutes ago the Premier was accused of not keeping political platform commitments, and here I did. It was in the platform, and I'll table that statement. The problem is funding for Shift was not mentioned in the Liberal platform, and I'll table the platform. My question is, now that the government has made it clear that this was a political decision, will the minister agree to stop playing politics with at-risk youth in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just because it's not in writing in a platform during a campaign, I think when the Premier and the member of Yarmouth stand before the media during a campaign election and unequivocally say that they are going to fund Shift, I think Nova Scotians can take them at their word. And the fact that it is funded, I really don't know what the issue is. You know, when I put my name on a ballot and I came from the nonprofit community, I had no idea.
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Community Services has the floor.
When I came from the nonprofit community and worked with homeless women and children leaving domestic violence for many years, I knew that sitting in this House was going to be a different experience. But at no time did I ever think that I would have to defend a decision to fund a community organization that had not had previous funding or that it was released from government funding over the previous years in this House. It just is absolute lunacy that I'm here defending that decision of this party, of this government.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just to quote the minister again from yesterday, I think it's really unfair when organizations criticize other organizations for getting funding. I'm sure that Dave Porter, Executive Director for Roots for Youth in Pictou County, would find that statement unfair. Mr. Speaker, the minister said she would come to Pictou County and tour a number of facilities with me, and I am most grateful for that. The decision to deny Roots for Youth funding was made some time ago, yet the minister admitted yesterday that she was hearing about this organization for the first time. And I just want to remind, there is a quote from the platform from this government: if we're going to put Nova Scotians first, we need to care for our citizens. Affordable housing and support for families are not luxuries. They are a moral responsibility. We want to make sure that those who need help get it, and those best able to help have the resources they need. Pictou County's Roots for Youth needs help desperately. There was 5 people laid off this week. And my question is the minister willing to reconsider her department's decision to deny funding once she tours the facility and sees its merit? Or is the tour just a stall tactic?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
No, it's not a stall tactic. I'll go any corner of this province and look at any nonprofit if they have a solid business case and a good case for support. I will remind the honourable member that in the last couple of months since we've been elected, we've invested $500,000 in transition houses, including second stage housing. We have invested $2 million in 23 family resource centres that had not seen a bump in funding in 10 years. We have funded a youth shelter, and we have increased funding to the child tax benefits so that 1,300 children who are low income now take advantage of that tax rebate. So not only have we met our commitments, we've gone beyond our commitments.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Too long is right. It's about to get longer. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Internal Services. All the hits all the time, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one of the files that this new department has is that of environmental services, excuse me. In July 2013, new regulations regarding contaminated sites took effect. These require the persons or body responsible for properties declare if they are contaminated, whether they exceed ministerial protocol or not. This also includes government properties, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister is, can he give us an update on how many government-owned sites have been identified or brought to his attention thus far, and what's the plan of action they may be remediated at?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this point, I cannot give a finite number as to how many sites there are. We are still reviewing them. I will get that number and pass it on to the honourable member. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, according to the Premier, the goal of creating this department was to get the government's house in order, which should include making sure it cleans up its own contaminated sites. Mr. Speaker, the regulations set out by the Department of Environment took effect in July 13, Mr. Speaker, and they state that the party responsible will have 2 years to clean up or manage the contaminated sites, which include a duty to take all reasonable measures to remediate, remove, and prevent contamination. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister responsible for Environmental Services is that can he tell us the number of sites or the bases that have been identified as being above ministerial protocol following the July 2013 regulations, and what the estimated cost is to have these cleaned up in the next 2-year window?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as the honourable member has mentioned, we did create this department to find deficiencies in government, and that's what we are doing. And at this point, as I mentioned earlier, I will get that information for the member and pass it on to him. At this point, I do not have the exact number. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I understand that this is a huge and difficult undertaking for the Minister, given the number of properties owned by the government. But, Mr. Speaker, recently, with these new regulations that have taken effect, This is only one from the government department, just TIR we've been talking about, Mr. Speaker. But there are other properties such as health, community services, housing, education, and there may be even more needs to be addressed. So I'm sure the Minister understands the concerns of all Nova Scotians when it comes to these sites. So my final supplementary to the Minister of Internal Service is simple. Can he tell us how much is allocated in the budget for these cleanups, or does he plan to ignore the 2-year cleanup window that the Department of Environment has assessed?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Mr. Speaker, the Department is looking at these properties, and any environmental concern that could harm residents or people in Nova Scotia is a concern to us, and it should be a concern to every member in this House, and I can assure them that we will ensure that Nova Scotians are safe and that they are not harmed from these properties. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Community Services. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians are struggling to pay the bills. Many hard-working families are barely making ends meet, and unfortunately some are even unable to afford the basic necessities. So my question to the Minister is simply, what is the current number of Nova Scotians who receive income assistance?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank the Honourable Member for the question, Mr. Speaker. Currently there are a little over 29,000 families, which translates into a little over 40,000 people province-wide.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, every Nova Scotian who is able to should have the opportunity to know the dignity of work. The Harvest Connection program allows income assistance clients to gain working skills and keep a portion of the money earned from working in the seasonal harvesting of field crops like berries, vegetables, and apples, and the harvesting of Christmas trees. My question to the Minister is, what is the current number of participants in the Harvest Connection program?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't actually have that current number, and I'll get that back to you. One of the issues that we're looking at in our transformation is that currently folks who are on income assistance and want to work in a part-time position to maybe transition into the workforce are able to keep $150 per month, and then after that it's 30% of their income, and for persons on disability it's 330%. One of the areas that we're looking at is perhaps maybe a transformation where that safety net would be there a little longer and a little wider, so the incentive to move off the system and to permanently attach to the labour force would be the goal in the end, which is our goal in the department, and for many Nova Scotians on income assistance is their goal as well.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, social safety net exists to help our most vulnerable, but Nova Scotia needs everyone reaching their highest potential if we're ever going to get our economy back on track. Mr. Speaker, in estimates, the Minister of Community Services spoke at length about dependency on the social system. She also shared her goals for income assistance, saying, do I see income assistance increasing over the next couple of years in terms of people coming on it? Honestly, I don't. I have instructed my department this year that I want to see a net zero, so that every person coming on, I want to see a person going off. Mr. Speaker, I'll table that some answer. Mr. Speaker, to me that sounds like we're going to accept the status quo. So my question to the Minister is, has she resigned to the fact that Nova Scotia is going to maintain its current income assistance levels? And does the Minister accept that we live in a province where Nova Scotia simply trade places on the assistance line?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm so disappointed with that question, because the Honourable Member knows that my goal in the next 4 years, and hopefully beyond, will be to attach people who want to work, who can work, to the labour market. I clearly said in the first year of transformation that was the goal we were going to set. If one person comes in, one person goes off. I don't want income assistance to be seen as a career path. So we have to work with folks who are able to work right now, help them find jobs, and we're there also to support people who are facing multiple challenges and barriers within their lives so that they can reach their full potential in the labour market. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount. Again.
Mr. Speaker, this question is the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Media Reports last night said she was unaware of the dollar amount involved in the Cobequid Children's Centre or whether any monies can be recuperated. One lady has already paid $1,500 for April and received 6 to 7 days of care for her children. Plus, she has items belonging to her children locked inside. Another family paid $660 in cash for April and May and are wondering if they'll ever see it again. So my question to the Minister is, promises have been made concerning an investigation, and when can this investigation start?
The Honourable Minister of Early Childhood Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the member opposite, I do have some statistics that I can share with him. I will say that the door was closed at that centre on April the 14th, and on April 16th, we, having failed other ways to communicate with the owner, did send by registered mail a letter to the owner, and in that we were able to identify part of the money that we believe was an overpayment because they were only open for those few days in April, and we have requested that that money, that amount, $4,300, be forwarded to the Minister of Finance. That is only part of the repayment. The other part has to do with a calculation on individual subsidies.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount on his first supplementary.
And Mr. Speaker, I'm glad to hear that some of those monies are going to be recuperated. So I guess my next question is, as of today, has she been able to find out if the facility's gone into receivership, or if money's garnished by the federal, if there was money garnished by the federal government, or whether parents expecting money back will be able to get it?
The Honourable Minister of Early Childhood Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I said yesterday, our priority is to make sure that the students, the children who had places at that daycare do find another space. That has been our priority, and we will continue to work with those families. There were 45 students there at the time of the closure, and we have 27 of those students who have now, with our assistance and the work of other centres in the area, found a placement. So that is our priority, but that's not to say that we will ignore or give up on the monies that are owing the government.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount. No more questions. The Honourable Member for Sydney Whitney Pier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Immigration. The Ivany Report, Now or Never, an urgent call to action for Nova Scotians. They shared a goal of seeing Nova Scotia receive its appropriate share of the international immigrants to Canada, which is approximately 7,000 new permanent residents per year. Will the Minister of Immigration introduce legislation respecting the immigration goal set out in the Ivany Report, and if not, why not?
The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very pleased to rise in the House and address this question. Immigration is a top priority for this government, and it's a top priority for this minister. I've taken my job as Minister of Immigration very seriously because I want to attract and retain immigrants, including international students, who will choose to make Nova Scotia their home. I look forward to advancing various initiatives that will focus on the importance of immigration to Nova Scotia in using all possible pathways, so not just international students, not just through the provincial nominee program, but all federal pathway systems to Canada. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Sydney Whitney Pier on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the previous government worked hard to push the federal government to increase the number of immigrant nominees that Nova Scotia receives. Our immigration strategy, Welcome to Nova Scotia, helped the province nominate the highest number of immigrants in the province's history. My question to the Minister, in negotiating with the federal government, has she given them a number to consider when increasing the cap is key to making progress? What is the number that the Immigration Minister has given to the federal government as her goal for immigration nominees?
The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In fact, what I found out was that through the previous government, we closed our international student stream. That does not exist anymore provincially. And what I found out is some of the other provinces still have it. So through the various discussions I've had with the Federal Minister of Immigration, I've made it very clear that Nova Scotia is not satisfied with the CEC federal stream, and that we intend to ask them to market the stream that for our province of Nova Scotia, because at the moment the marketing strategy is not working for us provincially when it comes to these international students. Also made it very clear that we want to keep the lines open, that we will introduce our own international student streams. And I've had positive discussions on that with the Minister of Immigration federally. Thank you.
The honourable member for Sydney Whitney Pier on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, increasing the federal immigration nominee program cap placed on Nova Scotia takes a lot of lobbying. It's important that the work start right away. As the Ivany report says, it's now or never. Will the minister report back to this House next week on her goal for increasing the immigration nominee cap so that all Nova Scotians can assist her in urging the federal government to move quickly on this issue?
The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I very much agree with the notion now or never. I always live for now. Taking a very, very close look at what has happened in the past so that I can improve on my future. Developing our and working on our increasing our numbers. We've got to develop an efficient partnership between both universities, local businesses, and our multicultural communities and every MLA in this province. So definitely I agree with that. The federal government is also initiating a new stream. It's called the Express Entry, which will begin in January 2015, and I'm hoping that Nova Scotia will be a key player in Atlantic Canada in implementing and designing that stream. Thank you.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Agriculture. Mr. Speaker, we have over 5,000 food establishments in this province, and we have 24 public health inspectors who are responsible for inspecting those establishments. That equals out to about 210 places per inspector. Mr. Speaker, on April 11th in a Chronicle Herald news story, which I will table, the Minister's regional manager said that the vast majority of these establishments have low or no deficiencies. However, that contradicts the story in which they reported a number of problems, including pests, vermin, and failing to protect food from contamination. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister, will the Minister clarify to this House these contradictory statements concerning food inspection in that article?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the member for the question. Indeed, we do over 10,000 inspections a year. And there are some discrepancies, as has been reported in the paper, and that's understandable. But indeed, from the number of inspections that's done and the number of infractions that are found are a small portion of the actual inspections that are done.
The honourable member for Kings North.
I'd like to thank the Minister for that answer. Mr. Speaker, a basic requirement of the provincial regulations is that every licensed establishment must have food safety training. However, not all restaurants are meeting that requirement. One that was pointed out in that article was a business in New Minas where 5 inspections took place between February 2012 and January this year, and not once did the owner-operator have the required training. And once again, that was in that April 11th article. Does this concern the Minister? Why would 5 inspections have taken place and that have failed and no disciplinary action have been handed down?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much. I cannot comment on any individual inspection on any restaurant because it may still be under investigation. So in the event that there's violations, fines will be levied and corrective action will be taken.
The honourable member for Kings North on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my understanding that warnings were handed down in that case, but evidently they are not working too effectively. In fact, 27 food operations were issued, in some cases, multiple warnings. A Halifax food establishment was cited 6 times in the past year for lack of trained staff, and a Windsor business was been cited over 30 times since May 2011 for multiple violations, including lack of trained staff. My question, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister is: Nova Scotians expect more from their eating establishments than just warnings that are repeatedly ignored. How does the Minister plan to address this situation?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Our department works closely with the Restaurant Association, and also our inspectors are instructed to cite violations if indeed they are violations, and they try to work closely with the restaurants to make sure that these violations are corrected. If they're not corrected, appropriate action will be taken and have been taken in the past. And anyone that wants to see what the violations are or how restaurants stack up in violations, go on the website, the government website. They can see very clearly where the inspection was done and the results of the inspection, so they're all public.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Justice. Just 3 months ago, the government indicated they are considering ankle bracelets for some patients at the East Coast Forensic Hospital in the interest of public safety. Last year, 42 patients went absent without leave from the facility. Has the Minister made any progress on a tracking system for patients, for their safety and for the general public's safety?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Let me flip to the next section. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What was your question? Can you please repeat that? There was too much.
The Honourable Member for Inverness, please repeat the question.
Mr. Speaker, my question was that 3 months ago the government had indicated that they were going to look at using ankle bracelets for some patients at the East Coast Forensic Hospital. Last year there were 42 people who went absent from the facility, and I was asking the Minister if that Minister has made any progress on a tracking system for patients, for their safety and for the safety of the general public.
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for repeating that. Again, I've said that, and I've said that many times. These people are patients. They are in a hospital. Now, having said that, I can tell you that I have met with the Minister of Health, and we are looking at various options and exploring that. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Inverness on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I just want to share a couple of quotes, and I take the Minister at her word that she is exploring this. I want to share a couple of quotes from her government when they were in opposition by the member from Cape Breton Richmond. Mr. Speaker, that member had indicated that cutting back the GPS monitoring program and said that if it is decided that individuals should be released because of the nature of the crimes that they've been charged with, an ankle bracelet should be an option. So, Mr. Speaker, clearly, when in opposition, this government believed in ankle bracelets. So, could the Minister give us some indication in terms of specifics, in terms of timelines, when this government looks to move on more ankle bracelets?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We do use electronic monitoring and other options in situations where it is effective and efficient. If he's talking about bail supervision, as he very well knows, these are implemented by a judge in the court, and these are not within our discretion in the government. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Inverness on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know that a judge would like probably to, if he or she is going to require that a patient wear an ankle bracelet, that the system needs to have the ankle bracelets to be worn, and only the government can supply those, Mr. Speaker. So my question, when will the Minister of Justice take action and let us know about what action is being taken to increase the number of ankle bracelets available to health professionals and law enforcement?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I am informed that we can give you a bit of an answer, and let me just defer that to Minister of Health and Wellness.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Hey, throw away your question now.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Yes, in fact, I promised the member for Hants West that I'd have a 20-minute introduction to health estimates, and an hour later, the Speaker was ringing a bell to shut me down. So, but anyway, no, the member from Inverness raises a really important question. I know it's one that is of great concern to the Tavel family. And one of the, I think, real improvements that have been made is that that unescorted passes are no longer now provided until the most rigorous and complete risk assessment is actually carried out. And we know in the last number of months this has actually helped to make an improvement. And yes, the Minister of Justice and I did meet with our department people to take a look at is this one of the directions that we want to go in terms of ankle bracelet monitoring? And I can tell the member that within a couple of months, the recommendation is going to be brought forward. As you know, we've had a very strong look at the buddy system, which is used in the UK, and we are now working to determine, are we talking about the same kind of patient? And that's very important in terms of making a decision for that future use here at the East Coast Forensics Hospital.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know time is short. 40 seconds. I'd like to know if the Minister of Transportation could give us an update on the report on Kites Hill.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The report is finished. It's just in the final drafting stage. The member has been very engaged, and that's an important corridor for the people in the Sydney-Glace Bay area. We're looking at roundabouts and some other options to slow down the traffic and make it safer. So it is an important question, and I'll just hand it to the Minister of Health to. No, just kidding. It is really important for us, and we're going to look into that. So I truly do thank the member for the question, and anything I can update him with, I certainly will do so. Thank you very much.
Order, please. The time allotted for oral questions by members to ministers has expired. We'll move on to opposition members' business. I recognize the Deputy House Leader for the official opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call private members' public bills for second reading?
Private members' bills for second reading. Bill number...
I will.
The Honourable Deputy House Leader for the official opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call Bill number 8, the Nova Scotia Jobs Fund Transfer Act?
Private members' bills for second reading. Bill number 8. The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's an honour to rise in my place today to speak to this Bill number 8, an act to transfer the assets of the Nova Scotia Jobs Fund from the Department of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism to the Nova Scotia Business Incorporated. Now, Mr. Speaker, we've heard a lot about this bill over the number of years, and we've heard a lot of different names on it.